make a start. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daisy. I work for Getting On Board, and we're delighted to be running this session this afternoon as part of our trustee learning programme. So I'm hoping you're all here to hear from Liz about setting a reserves policy, which I'm very excited to be here for the session as well. Just before I hand over to Liz, I just got a couple of housekeeping bits, which I'm basically going to talk through the slide on the screen. So you would have just heard the Zoom lady tell us that the session is being recorded. We'll send you this recording following the session so you can watch it and share it with your board. And we'll also send you the slides that Liz uses as well. If I could ask you to stay muted on the call unless you're asked to unmute to ask a question or make a comment. And we're asking that not because we don't want to hear from you, but because we want to make sure it's clear that everyone can hear who's talking. If you find closed captions useful, they are available, but you need to enable these. So you should have a button along the side that says enable closed captions. That comes through to me. I say yes, and you'll be able to see those. The chat will go alongside this. Please use it as you'd like. If you find the chat a bit distracting, you also don't need to get distracted by that. You can absolutely listen to Liz. We will take questions at the end. It's a bit of a meaty topic, so we'll let Liz kind of talk it all through and then have some questions at the end. And just to remind you that this isn't an advice session specifically about your organisation, so if you could keep your questions kind of broad, questions around reserves policy making, that would be much appreciated. And then lastly, before I hand over to Liz, the reason why the session is running, why we've got the fantastic trustee learning programme and that it's all free, is thanks to our sponsors Rathbones. So we just wanted to give them a big shout out for sponsoring the programme. So on that note, I shall hand over to Liz.
Brilliant. Thanks, Daisy. It's really, really nice to be here. It's very nice to see you all. We have 47 people. And we're here for an hour to think about reserves, which is a really nice way actually to spend a lunch break on a sunny day, I find. Right. And so, as you would imagine, there are slides, and there are a few slides. There's a fair bit to get through. Daisy said it's a meaty topic, and it is. And this is an introductory session. We're going right back to first principles and thinking about the real basics and then layering it up. And I hope it's useful. Any questions, put them in chat and we'll pick them up. We'll try and pick them up at the end. Okay, people, I'm going to start sharing slides. And if you're having lunch, if you have your video on, fantastic. If your video off, absolutely fine. Be comfortable and hopefully this will be of interest or use. Right, so I am a charity finance and governance consultant. I used to be a finance director in the sector for national organisations, some grant making, some grant seeking, for about 15 years. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I became a consultant. And I mainly work with funders and infrastructure bodies, training, mentoring, but I do roll my sleeves up, and I am an external finance director for a few smaller charities. And I run a really tiny non-profit social enterprise called Embrace Finance, which works with people to build financial confidence. Actually, I fell into finance 20 odd years ago. I'm a bookkeeper by trade. I fell into it as an administrator for a charity, and then I fell in love with it. It does something to my brain that makes me very happy. And I'm a co-founder of the Small Charity Friendly Collective, and we do free events. I've been a trustee and treasurer on and off since 2007, I think, and I'm currently trustee and treasurer of the Association of Chairs, and we think about governance a lot. We think about financial governance a lot, and some of you are members. So I'm a member in practice at the Institute of Accounting and Bookkeeping, which means I have to jump through loads of regulatory hoops every year. But to be clear, I'm a bookkeeper. I'm not a chartered accountant, and I have a master's in charity accounting. And all of that was really, really useful, but nowhere near as useful as just being in charge of charity finance functions for the 20 odd years that I have been. And I generally work with organisations up to 1 million, maybe 2 million. And if you have any questions afterwards, either go through Daisy or my contact details are here. Please don't be a stranger. We're drawing really heavily today on the Charity Commission guidance, CC19, which is called Reserves and Resilience. Reserves is really organisational specific. There's no one size fits all, as we'll see as we go through. So regardless of what I say, I think the big takeaway is just go back to the primary guidance, read through it, find yourself in it and apply it to your own organisation. We're doing, I think it used to be about 40 pages. I looked at it again in preparation for this. I run this session quite often, and so I read it a lot, and I think it shrunk a bit, which is wonderful, isn't it? Normally these guidance notes get longer and longer. I think this one got shorter. But what I would say is that there are 163,000 charities on the register, and the Commission writes fantastic guidance. And it's written for all of them. It's principles based, it's not standards based. It doesn't say, right, you have to have this, you have to have 3 months or 6 months in reserve. It says these are the principles as trustees we need to think about when leading our organisations, when stewarding our funds. And so we do have to do a bit of work actually to find ourselves in it. And reserves is one of those areas where actually it's technical, it's regulated, we want clarity. It's not always easy to get the clarity. And so having some professional advice and guidance at some point, if you have an accountant in the mix, an auditor, independent examiner, chartered accountant on your board, I think is really helpful. Okay. Nonetheless, we can all become, to some extent, reserves experts, without a doubt. You know, the book is written for everyone, but only we know our charity. And we're doing that bird's eye view today. We are circling above and looking down, and we're looking at what reserves are and what we might want them for. We're going to touch on how we might work out a sensible reserves policy. We're going to look at what a reserves policy should include, and then how to keep that under review. It's not a dusty policy that sits in the drawer. It's a live, living, active policy, really, when it works really well. We're going to touch on when to consider using reserves, and we'll touch on tips on how to build reserves. But it's not a fundraising session. And if I could write a book on how to build reserves, I would, but it's really very difficult, as we all know. There are challenges. It's not easy. I don't have any magic white rabbits to pull out the hat, I'm afraid. So cracking on, what are reserves and what are they for? And I think a bit of wider context is really helpful here. When I think of finance, I think we have 3 jobs. I think we need to get what we call the recording right, the systems and processes, really good foundations. All those things we typically think of: bookkeeping, budgeting, accounting. Crack that, probably 70% of the way there. And that will tell us what the numbers are. We can't stop there. Job number 2, we need to know what the numbers mean. Are the decisions that we are taking us towards a more sustainable future, which is largely around costing and cost recovery, and a more resilient future, which is largely at looking up and out and being able to respond and manage risk? And we can't really stop there. The orange boxes will tell us what the numbers are. The blue ones will tell us what they mean. We need these green boxes to tell us what to do. We are trustees. The buck stops with us. We need to understand our financial model, even if we're in a tiny, tiny organisation. How does it all fit together? Where are the fault lines in it? Building a sustainable charity is really, really difficult. The odds are stacked against us. There will be financial risks. That's okay. It's not for the faint-hearted, but we're here to change the world. We're dedicated. But we need to understand the risks and come up with a strategy to manage them in a way that's compliant with the governance and regulatory framework. And ultimately, I think we need to really, really be confident in our storytelling. We will be telling the story, whether we like it or not, in our annual accounts, in our fundraising applications, in our budgeting, in our management reporting, in our board meetings. There will be a narrative. And if we seek funds from funders, they will be reading it in our annual accounts. If we do AGM reports to members, we'll be telling our financial story. Well, we want to be intentional about it. Even where there are risks, we want to demonstrate that we're managing it. And what reserves, what we're talking about today, sits in all three jobs. We need really good numbers to be able to keep track on what our actual reserves are and whether they're within our agreed policy or slightly outside of it. We need really good reports that can show us whether our reserves are going up or going down, and ideally what they might look like in the future if we've got lots of fixed costs and we need to navigate financial uncertainties. And the reserves policy is set by the board. So reserves are firmly up here in the green boxes as well. So reserves is one of those wonderful finance topics that brings in everything. It brings in everything. It's so integral. And I just, sticking with this context for a bit longer, in short, reserves, if we're really new, we can think of them as rainy day funds. People often say, oh, reserves are the funds we hold back for the rainy day. And they are, that's absolutely true. But also, they are really, at most simplest put, those unrestricted funds that we haven't yet spent. So any funds that we have in our accounts currently that we haven't yet spent, that are unrestricted, and we'll look at what restricted and unrestricted means, are our de facto reserves. And as charities, our job is to spend. We're here to change the world, or to make people's lives better, communities stronger, oceans cleaner. So we're here to spend, and it's perfectly reasonable to hold money back for the rainy day, to manage risk, and it's prudent to do so. Prudence is one of those duties that we have as trustees, but we need to be intentional. We need to be intentional, and we need to be transparent about how much we're holding back and why. And so we are required as trustees to have a policy, and it has to be risk-based because it's principles-based again. It's not standards. The Charity Commission doesn't say, right, you need 3 or 6 months. We have to determine the level that we need. And sadly, there is no one size fits all, I'm afraid. We have to kind of do the hard work, go through the pain barrier. It's a bit like bear hunt. You can't go over it. You can't go under it. You have to do the work, work out how much you need, and really customize it to your own organization. So we take a risk-based approach, and we decide how much we intend to hold in reserve to cover our risks, and maybe maximize opportunities, and how much we actually have. We need to keep on top of that. And we need a plan. We need to have some kind of strategy. Are we going to be building up our reserves? Are they currently under our target range? Maybe we need to spend down. Maybe we've got excess reserves. I know a lot of charities that came out of COVID lockdown with stronger balance sheets, and they went into it, and their job at the moment is spending down some of their reserves, even though there's still a financial cliff ahead of them. It's not always a very easy financial story to tell. Once we've drafted our reserves policy, we've agreed it as a board, we are jointly and severally liable. We all want to look to the trustee or the treasurer, but we're all jointly and severally liable. We're all in it together. We take collective responsibility for this. We then publish it in our trustees' annual report every year, and if we're big enough, it gets filed with the Charity Commission, and it's a public-facing policy. And for completeness, I ought to say that if we decide not to have a reserves policy, we need to state that also in the trustees' annual report. This has only happened to me once. I've worked for a number of charities, and I've worked with over, well, hundreds, if I'm honest, over the last 20 odd years, to varying degrees. One I worked quite closely with, which had, when I started, decided not to have a reserves policy. It was a grant-making organisation, and future investment returns were funding activity and were fairly reliable at that stage. And then things changed during the course while I was there, and we did introduce a reserves policy. So it's rare, it does happen, but you need to be really intentional about it, and about not having a reserves policy, and make sure that you're still covering all your financial risks. And I think it is, in my experience, I can't speak for all 163,000 charities, I think it's rare. It's not just a tick box exercise, a reserves policy. It's not really something, I mean, sometimes we do, don't we? We're in a hurry and we update it and refresh it and dust it off and update the trustees' annual report. But a really good reserves policy will help our decision making as trustees. It helps us think through the risks, mitigate them, navigate uncertainty, move slowly but maybe surely towards a more resilient future or sustainable future. And a really good one will tell our financial story. There was a charity in the public press at the weekend, a big established one, and in a headline story, and in the headline story, which I leapt on because it talked about reserves, it gave a figure for their reserves. It says this charity has X in reserve. So obviously what do you do when you read that? You go on the Charity Commission register, you download the annual accounts and you have a good look yourself and you think, wow, that sounds quite good, that level of reserves. And when I read it, I thought, I don't agree. I don't think that is the level of reserves, actually. I think if you take the purest definition of it, I would come up with a different number. But in the reserves policy that was stated, it was the quoted number in the news article. And our financial storytelling is really important. We have to be really clear. We have to tell the story. This is what we've got in reserve, and make that calculation as clear as we can. And when we do that, even if the numbers go the wrong way, as they often do in charities, it's difficult. We're squaring a circle often. It gives confidence. Yes, we can see there are risks. Maybe our actual reserves are lower than our target, but we've thought through them, we're managing it, and this is how we're managing it. So good reserves policy gives assurance to lenders and creditors. And if you read CC 19, which I'm sure you all will be tonight with a cup of tea after dinner, this list comes from that, apart from the top one. It gives assurance that we can meet our financial commitments, and it helps us manage risk, frankly. And that gives confidence to us, to funders, to members, regulators, independent examiners, and auditors. A good reserves policy takes us an awful long way, but the most important point for me out of all of it really is just it's critical to our resilience. It's what helps keep the lights on. An organisation I worked for a few years ago, the board was really clear. I was the finance director and the board was really clear. They said, right, your one job is to build up the reserves, just set the budgets, manage the budgets, so our reserves go from X to X over this, I don't know, 3 or 4 year period. That was one of the most helpful directives I've ever had from a board when I've been a finance director. It's given me a finance strategy to work to so I can keep the lights on. And so to recap, we need a reserves policy. There is no one size fits all. There's no slide in here that you can take at the end and change the name. Job done. But there are slides, hopefully, we can change other bits and it's nearly job done. We need to set and state our target reserve. And it needs to be an active policy. So we need to monitor it. And to do that, that means that we need to know what we actually have in reserve. So those really are our key jobs. And that's what we're going to look at now. So how do we calculate actual reserves? This, I think, is a fairly simple affair when you write it down. I used to be a grant maker, and as part of that, often I was asked to read trustees' annual reports, and I would look at the reserves policy in the annual report and the stated amount of reserves, and I'd go to the financial statements at the back and I'd do my quick sum, and I couldn't often make the two numbers meet. This sounds simple. In practice, we go down rabbit holes. So we're really going to go right back to first principles now. I don't think it's as complicated as maybe it sometimes is made to be. Okay, so reserves, CC 19, quote, unquote, are that part of a charity's unrestricted funds that is freely available to spend on any of the charity's purposes. So the two most important words in this sentence, unrestricted funds, freely available. Okay. You may well be familiar with funds. Brilliant. If not, quick recap. Money comes in to the charity. It's not all equal. Some of it is gifted to us with a restriction for a specific purpose. It's restricted to something that is narrower than our charitable objects in our trust deed, our memorandum of articles of understanding, articles of association. We have to apply that money to a particular thing. And it might be a big pot that just sits there, it gets invested, it throws off income from investments, and we spend that. And that's typically how grant makers work. And that might be a permanent endowment or an expendable. That's a wonderful subject, but we can't go there today. We have to move on, okay? Or it comes in as income and we spend it out on a project. We're probably most of us familiar with restricted funds. Hopefully, at least some of the time, the income that we get is free from restriction. We can spend it on anything in our charitable objects. Unrestricted money, worth twice as much as restricted. Love restricted money, love any grants. With a professional hill I would die on. Do away with the restrictions and we will make everyone so much more sustainable overnight. But anyway, we are where we are. Unrestricted money, we can, as trustees, ring fence for a particular purpose. The minivan, the minibus is gonna, one of our buses, it needs replacing next year. A community transport organisation, maybe half the fleet needs replacing. We can see it come in. It's not going to be affordable through general income. We can ring fence some of our reserves. Designated funds have rules. Briefly, they need to be time bound, very specific. And we need to say when we've undesignated them. Anything that we haven't set aside or ring fence for a particular purpose goes into our general fund. And you would think that at that point, that is our reserve, but actually there's a couple more steps. Over time, inevitably, we will have spent some of our restricted general funds, unrestricted general funds, on fixed assets. And if they're for charitable usage, so they are the minibus or they're the office or yada yada, we use them in our charitable activities and they're not liquid. We don't count them in our reserves because they're not readily available. So our reserves are that bit of our general fund that is readily available, and it's generally in cash. It might be tied up in current debtors or creditors, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole now. But when we're thinking of reserves, we're thinking of unrestricted that is freely available. And when we talk about reserves, I would be strict. I would talk about this pot here. People often talk about restricted reserves or talk about reserves generally and then say, oh, unrestricted and now restricted. And I think that's confusing. I would say our reserves, by definition, have to be unrestricted. We may talk about restricted funds brought forward. We may, if we really want to, talk about restricted reserves, but be very clear when we talk about reserves, we talk about unrestricted funds that are freely available. And so after this, go back, open your wonderful set of charity accounts and start working it out. What are your unrestricted funds that are freely available? And if you're new to this and you haven't done this before, start with the unrestricted funds, go to the balance sheet, look at the bottom, look at your total unrestricted funds, and we'll look at an example in a minute. Take off any fixed assets for charitable usage. The for charitable usage bit is important because sometimes where we might invest some of our reserves, and if we've got investments, they might sit up in the fixed assets bit of the balance sheet, but we wouldn't necessarily deduct them. It's the tangible fixed assets that we deduct. And that's where the complication can come in. And sometimes you might just want to talk it through with your accountant or auditor. We then deduct any funds that we as a board have designated. And if we have, they should be on our balance sheet as well. And then we might, if we're larger or more complex, have things like social investments or other liabilities that aren't on the balance sheet. Again, that's like grey area. We want to get rid of those as well. If we're smaller, we will probably know if we've got social investments or other liabilities. And if we are not aware, then we probably don't if we're smaller. If we're larger, we probably need to talk it through again. And so if we're unsure where to start, go to the balance sheet on your most recent set of annual accounts on the Charity Commission Register. The balance sheet will look like this. The green boxes at the top will tell us everything we have in terms of assets and liabilities. It goes down in order of liquidity. So it starts with fixed assets, then it moves to current assets. There, that's everything we own. Then it moves to everything that we are owed, and then, sorry, that we owe out, and then it gives us the net between the two. And then the bottom bit of the balance sheet will explain whether everything we own is either restricted, unrestricted, or designated. And so my question to you is, how much has this charity got in reserve? And the chat went up there, did someone answer? No, not yet. If your cortisol is spiking a bit now because you feel under pressure and this answer has a right or a wrong, know that everyone's cortisol is probably spiking now, even if we're chartered accountants, which I'm not, because that is what numbers does to us, doesn't it? It's incredibly exposing. But if we follow through our very logical formula, we can see that our total unrestricted funds are 283,000. Let's round down, and we look up, have we got any fixed assets? Well, there's £1. Firstly, it's trivial, and two, it's in investments. It's not a tangible fixed asset, but we'll take it off maybe to be safe because it's trivial, or we leave it on. It doesn't really matter when it's £1. And then there aren't any designations. And so this charity, I'm sure this is what you've written down, has 283,000 in reserve. There are no fixed assets for charitable usage and no designated funds. This example is from the Charity Commission example accounts. It's Dorsetshire Drugs Advice Centre, I think it's called. I use this example monthly in training sessions, either one-to-one or in big groups. And I'm going to invite you now to calculate on this slightly more complicated balance sheet. The other one was a lovely simple one. How much this charity has in reserve. Now we're creating the neural pathways if we're new to it. It's the same process. We look at unrestricted funds. These are helpfully broken down already into designated, revaluation funds, and general funds. And I'm not going down the rabbit hole of revaluation funds. It's not a huge amount. We can assume it's probably related to maybe the investments, but the unrestricted funds are already split out for us. We know what general funds are now. We saw them on the fund tree. We can look up at the top of the balance sheet. The tangible fixed assets are split out. We might assume they're for charitable usage. We might assume they're not. Our answer would explain. And then we have some investments. Has anyone put in chat? Oh, Dawn and Jay Snowd and Connor, spot on. Well done. Brilliant. Thank you. Brilliant. Yes, Jay Snowd. Brilliant. Well done. And Dawn, you've had to is a guess at this. Wonderful. Okay, so what I'm going to say now is I'm going to show you the answer. And between us, no one's ever got it quite right, which I think is really interesting. Not once. So I'm sure people have, maybe to themselves, but out loud they haven't.
And salad.
Kathy, thanks, just putting you on hold. Okay, so while income funds, so that's unhelpful, isn't it? Because on the balance sheet it's called general funds, but now this is cut and paste from the Charity Commission's very good, very helpful example reserves policy. They've changed the word into income funds, which if you're a non-finance person can throw you entirely, that change of language. Don't be phased, stick with it. While income funds stand at 56,792, because we're now reserves experts, so we would have identified that this 56,792 is the general funds, and we know what the general fund is. That's where the reserve sits. A designation of 20 has been set aside for the purchase of the equipment, so we take that off, so it comes down to 36. 56 minus 20 comes down to 36, and a further 22,500 funds for office equipment up here, so we need to take that off, which leaves an available reserve of 14,292. So it's the 56 less the 20 less this 22,500. And so we do have to sometimes do a little bit of acrobatics, and if it's not immediately clear, that's okay, but let's agree collectively what it is and check it with our auditor, accountant, independent examiner. Knowing what our actual reserve is and being able to calculate it although the process is quite simple, can sometimes get a bit more convoluted when we get to the actual balance sheet. But it is worth investing that time in really working it out. And so to recap, when we're calculating our actual reserve, it's unrestricted funds, less fixed assets for charitable usage, less designated funds, less any social investments, and any other liabilities. And that is our actual reserve. And we can't stop there. Yes, we need to know how much we have, but we also need to know whether, is that enough? Which really is the $64 million question. Is it enough? And reserves are really heavily politicized. So for some people, it will be too much. For others, it might not be enough. There is no one size fits all. And there's really actually no one methodology. Our target reserve, the number we finally land on, and I always have a range because it always feels to be a little bit of uncertainty. This might happen, that might happen. I might have a minimum and a maximum. Needs to reflect our own particular circumstances. So we need to sit through and methodically think through the reasons we might need them, the financial risks that are ahead, and try and quantify them, put a number to them. This comes from NCVO's Almanac 2022, which I'm sure, like me, you pore over when it comes out because the charts are just so illuminating. And what it does, the writing's tiny, but when it comes round, you might be able to enlarge it. What it does is it gives all the subsectors here, faith-based, international, umbrella bodies, grant making, and it gives here along the bottom the number of months held in reserve. And you can see that research charities are about 80 months. You would expect that probably, they do longitudinal studies. The next most well-reserved subsector, grant-making foundations, they've got about 32, 33 months. Again, not that surprising. And in defense to some, it can be difficult getting the money out the door quickly sometimes. The rest, there are a few that have over 10 months, faith-based, housing, development, and everyone else comes in about 3 to 6 months. And I think as a sector, there's a myth that we need 3 to 6 months. And I would say resist that myth. That might be where you end up, because we will probably express it in a number of months. And if we end up there, take comfort from the fact that most people do. But actually, I would resist jumping to that. Let's think it through. We've got to be intentional. We need to make sure that when we're at the top of the mountain, we've got the oxygen that we need to come down. And so the best time to think about reserves is all the time. And the best time to review the policy is when we are planning. It's an integrated, strategic bit of our financial planning. Even if we're tiny, we're thinking about reserves as we're thinking about the budget. So if we're about to do a big strategic review, fantastic, include reserves. If we're about to do an annual work plan or an annual budget, fantastic, think about reserves. Now, the first draft might be done by the finance director if we have the luxury of having a finance team or even staff, and the treasurer if we have the luxury of having a treasurer. They can be hard to find, but it has to be owned. No matter who does it, it has to be owned collectively by the leadership if we have employed staff and the board of trustees. And if we're a small charity, and SORP, the statement of recommended practice, which is the accounting regs for charities, says that a small charity is under £500,000 a year. The guidance, CC19, says, think through these 3 questions. Do we need them? How much do we need? And do we have enough? And it goes on to give these really helpful examples of things that we might have in our little universe that mean that we ought to have reserves. The risk of an unforeseen emergency. You know, a member of staff goes on sick, or we will have to go online overnight. I mean, for me, that's prudent. I think there's always an unforeseen emergency about to happen, but I can be a bit Eeyore. Covering unforeseen day-to-day operational costs. A budget is great, but it's out of date the minute the ink dries. The world's moved on. It's easy to miss things in the budget, or for things just to come up, isn't it? Sometimes grants, maybe there's a delay in the grant, maybe we've been given the green light by the funder, but we're not till the next funding round, or there needs to be a gap between funding agreements, or a contract where service, we deliver public services and the local authority, we're likely to get the renewal, but the cogs are a bit slow, so we're not getting the money in time. Or maybe something's just changed. And we don't have the money for it. The minibus was due to last another couple of years, but it's got to be replaced this year. And maybe we've done our cash flow forecast, and actually income and expenditure look okay, but the timing means that we will have short-term deficits, and we need working capital. We need money in the bank to keep the lights on, we need gas in the tank. These are all very legitimate reasons for holding funds back in reserve. If we're larger, we need a more sophisticated approach. And for large charities here, the definition is an annual income of over 500,000. But I know a fair number of 500k organisations that have quite a complex setup that might actually benefit hugely from taking this more sophisticated approach. And we're not going through it now in detail, but there is a methodology here which is really useful that you might want to follow, and it takes a risk-based approach, and it looks at the whole diversification of income and the certainty and commitment level of expenditure, coupling that with the external review, uncertainty, future planning, and then it leads us to a deeper dive in the thinking on a reserves policy. Ultimately though, whether we're small or large, it's about looking ahead. It's about assessing risk. And actually, it all comes down really to judgment. What is our current financial position? Are we surviving, sustaining, or thriving? What do our possible financial futures look like? Are there sunlit uplands? Or is the weather, can we see the black clouds rolling in? How is all of this likely to affect our financial position? Did we start the year with reserves slightly under pressure? Or were we quite well reserved at the beginning of the financial year? Do we need a high or low reserve to manage all of this risk? How likely will all these risks crystallise at once? And so much of this is judgment. Self-awareness is really important. We all bring our money personality, our risk personality to all our financial management and decision making. So setting a reserves policy absolutely needs to be informed by risk and by the numbers. And I can set the same reserves policy 2 days running, and if I'm feeling like Eeyore one day, it's going to be a higher reserve I think we need than if I'm feeling like Tigger the next day. And so that's why we need to take this collective view and really talk it through and agree it as a board. And as always, diversity of thought makes for the best policy making. And what I found helpful in the past, where the numbers have been going the wrong way, the storm clouds are really rolling in, is what I call a sunset budget. I don't know if other people call it this. It's a minimum reserve. The Charity Commission is very clear. It's okay to close charity or a project, but we need to do it well, especially if there are vulnerable people in the mix. And a sunset budget is the amount we would need to close well, should we need to. And this is one example of a reserves calculation, where at the top, we maybe calculate the minimum reserve. Maybe we are really doom and gloom at the beginning. Okay, if we had to close, how much would it cost? Well, actually, maybe we list all these costs and we come to a figure, say, of 85,000 that we express in number of months running costs of about 3 months. That would keep us going for about 3 months. But we're planning for the worst, but hoping for the future. Or was it planning for the worst, preparing for the future? You know the phrase. And then actually, so if I have to close, I know we can do it well, but we're not going to close. We might be running a deficit budget. Our funding universe might be quite squeezed, but we're really good at what we do. We're really confident and we're ploughing ahead. And in that case, actually, we're expecting the grant to come in, but there might be a bit of gap in the timing. So we're going to allow for the salaries in that time, so we don't have to recruit. we were going ahead with the next strategic period. We want the new minibus. We're going to add that in. And maybe we need some working capital as well. We've done the cash flow forecast and it is looking a little bit uncomfortable and squeezed in places. So we might have a minimum and a maximum. We might have a range. We need between 85,000 and 170,000. And that's equivalent of between 3 months and 8 months. For a simple, smaller organisation, this might be perfectly adequate. For a larger organisation, we probably need something a bit more sophisticated. And then it comes to the question, well, how much is too much? Reserves are really politicised. Everyone's a reserves expert. And there isn't a single policy that will satisfy everyone. The number we come up with, we might find, closes some doors to us. We might think, well, actually, we need to rethink it. I don't think we can game our reserves policy to fit funder requirements. I think funders really helpfully put sometimes a reserves cap in their funding criteria. I think it's helpful because I think it gives us a clear steer as the seeker of grants, whether we're their priority list or not. So I think it's really helpful. I think it does sometimes distort the thinking. And I think sometimes we feel that we have to keep below certain caps, and that's a decision for you as a board. My preference would always be to work out how much we need as a charity and to set that as a reserves policy. And when some doors close, you know, others often open. And I think all we can do really is set the policy that's right for our organisation, follow the guidance, and be really clear in our financial storytelling. And so to recap, we need to consider the risks, quantify them. If we're a larger charity, we might need something more sophisticated, and I'll give you some examples at the end. Consider a range to reflect any uncertainties. Working to a fixed point is difficult. Then we draft the policy and then we publish it in our trustees' annual report. And we can't really stop there. There's certain wording that needs to go in it that we're going to run through now. And as you'd expect for smaller organisations, it's a bit lighter actually. We state the level of reserves held and why they're held. We explain if there's no reserves policy and the reason why. And where funds have been designated, we give an explanation for that. For larger organisations, the guidance says that we have to state that the amount of total funds the charity holds, the amount of restricted funds, sorry, I think got out of order there, the amount of designated funds and for how long, and the amount of reserves and how that compares to the target range. And I would be really, again, very purist around terminology. There is a difference between funds and reserves. And some reserves policies I read for larger organisations might say this organisation holds X in all reserves, and that will include their restricted, I don't like restricted reserves, and unrestricted. And that's potentially misleading. I would say the organisation holds X in funds, of which Y is free reserves. And then it's very, very clear the bits over which we have discretion as a trustee board. IVAR, the Institute of Voluntary Action Research, does great work, and one of its recent publications was thinking through charity reserves and arguing for or extolling the benefits of strategic reserves management. And they have come up with a definition or a model to explore what being strategic about reserves management is. And it's those things that we've covered already, really. It's about looking at everything in the round, looking at our budgeting and our work plan and our forecast and what funding is doing and what our activities are doing, rather than just thinking, okay, we're going to go for 3 or 6 months. It's looking at what's actually happening on the ground in our organisation. How is our staff team? Do we have long, real key person dependency risk? Do we have a long-standing member who might be leaving in the near future? Do we have a real specialism that we need to deliver a certain project? It's about being really clear about our time horizon. I think our financial statements often force us to look back. We look at our actuals for the year to date, maybe compare it to budget. Resilience is all about looking forward. What does the forecast look like? We don't need to plan in great detail, but the shape of things to come can help inform our thinking. Because if it looks really, if there's an iceberg out there and we're getting close, we might want a higher reserve. Or if it's really raining on our beneficiaries, we might choose to spend down our reserves. And this communication piece, I love this point about communication. Some reserves policies I read are 2 or 3 sentences. Ron Seal approach, does what it says on the tin. This is our reserve. Well, it's kind of helpful. But actually, if there are risks in the financial statement, we're running deficit budgets, reserves are going down. Stronger financial storytelling, being clear about what are funds and what is our reserve, being clear about, yes, we can see those risks, but we have got really good cost control, really good budgeting, really good forecasting. This is the reserve level we need. We can see the financial cliff ahead. That storytelling piece, I think, is really important. And so here, in this wonderful example, Dorsetshire Drugs Advice Centre, I'm going to wrap up in a minute. Let's look at what the Charity Commission gives as an example reserves policy to accompany this set of accounts. Well, I've put the paragraphs in. It's wordy, but that's okay, because it says everything that we would want it to say. It says it's taking a risk-based approach. We've examined the requirements in light of the main risks to the organisation. We've got a policy. It's only unrestricted funds that aren't in fixed assets, tick, tick. We've expressed it as a range between 3 and 6 months, and based on budgeted expenditure, that comes out between this non-monetary value. That's really helpful to know. This is why we're keeping them, to meet working capital requirements and a potential drop in funding, keep activities going. And this is what we actually have. It's a bit less, actually. It's just over 14,000, so it falls significantly short of the target level. We've got a plan, we've recognised the risk, and we've got a plan. The strategy is to continue to build reserves through planned operating surpluses. Not easy, but can be done. Recognise it's going to take time, probably 5 years. And in the meantime, we're probably watching it like a hawk. So if you want an example, look at the Charity Commission example accounts. There are various ones for different types of charities. Look at all the big infrastructure bodies, look at Charity Finance Group, Akivo, NCVO. I love reading through other reserves policies. You really learn a lot. And where I'm going to end is this, that we tend to think of reserves, this might be unfair. Often I think we can think of reserves as a statement in the trustees' annual report that we might do a light dusting over to refresh it. There's so much more than that. If we think that, for me, financial sustainability is the ability to keep stable, maybe grow. Financial resilience is the ability to see, look up and out, and expand and contract where we need to respond. The definition of organisational resilience, there are many. I did a piece of work with Lloyds Bank Foundation and 2 colleagues in lockdown, and we took the Cranfield School of Management definition. We were looking at organisational resilience. And it's the ability to anticipate, prepare for, adapt, and respond to change. We can't all be stable. We can't all grow. We can all be resilient. We can all breathe in and out and expand and adapt. And that's why reserves aren't just a dusty policy. They are really integral to our planning process. And anticipating is forecasting and looking ahead. And preparing, so much of that is about our reserves. Even when we don't have much, what might we gift our future selves, our future boards? Can we build them up somehow? How might adapting is about scenarios, what might be out there, and responding is about indicators. And we can't do a deep dive on resilience now because I've got an eye on the time and Daisy's about to jump in. But what I would say is, do you look at your reserves just at year end, as many organisations do, or do you have a system to look at them? Do you know if they're going up or if they're going down? This is an example set of management accounts. You've got restricted, actual versus budget, unrestricted, year-end forecast, and next year forecast. If you see 100 sets of annual accounts, they should all look the same, generally accepted accounting principles. If you look at 100 sets of management accounts, they will all look different. I probably have seen that many. I've never seen two exactly the same. So this is just an example of what I would want to see in a set somewhere. What I'd really want is to see the unrestricted separated out. I want my funds brought forward, as well as my income, expenditure and surplus deficit for the year, and my funds carried forward, because then I know what my reserves are now, what they might be at the end of the year, and what they might be next year. And then I can do this lovely chart here, very, very simple, and just see what our reserves prediction is compared to our minimum and maximum range. And then I can start to have a compass through the mists of uncertainty. If you can report on your reserves level quarterly, monthly in the year, you can start to monitor them and take the decisions that will lead you. I think it's very difficult when you get to year end and you only find out your reserves then. Some organisations I speak to, this one in particular, I won't go into detail, said they'd just done their annual accounts, they knew they dipped into their reserves, they didn't know how much, but it was more than they'd realised. Whereas if we report during the year where we can, you can make the decisions. And so there are common elephant traps I see time and time again in finance. The ostrich, we don't even look at the reserves. We just don't look. We wait till year end. Or we know they're going down, but we don't act. We don't set a financial strategy to recover them where we might need to. Or we don't, it is gut feel, but it's not backed up with a spreadsheet. I don't think a forecast is a forecast without a spreadsheet. I'll never take a verbal report. I don't want reassurance. I want assurance. Show me. The Micawber, I don't know if you read David Copperfield, Dickens, my favourite Dickens, and Micawber takes them all out for dinner after they've just been evicted because something will turn up by the time the bill comes, which is so polar opposite to me because I'm so much more risk averse. But it's that sense that something might turn up, or when we're passing budgets, when we're signing budgets off, is all the income confirmed, or is it pipeline? How much is pipeline? Is all the expenditure committed, or is some discretionary? What's the balance? Is something going to come up? Can we survive if it doesn't? Are we looking at the big picture? Have we got a chart that shows over time what's happening to our reserves? We can't rearrange the deck chairs as the ship is sinking, no matter how comforting it might feel at times. And the Polaroid, a balance sheet will be out of date the minute the ink is dry on it. And we want live data. Don't do one snapshot. Keep it live, keep it coming. And when you're after this, when you're now desperate to get on and read more about reserves, this is brilliant. Buy bond. Great tips for building reserves. There's no white rabbit. You can do full cost recovery, and that will help you recover all of your central core costs. You still need some unrestricted income coming in to build reserves, really. This report is also brilliant. I love it. If you want to really do a deep dive on strategic reserves management, it's practical. It's got good stuff in it. And this is a really nice way to think about reserves. Charities Aid Foundation. What do we need now, day to day? What do we need in the foreseeable future, the fridge? And what actually do we need over the longer term? What might we need to get from the freezer? And there's loads more, lots of questions. And that's it. And I think we have to find our inner Mr. Banks and fall in love with reserves and use them to really help us with our really difficult job of being a trustee, our really rewarding, wonderful, but really quite difficult job of being a trustee. And I'm going to stop now and say, Daisy, are there any questions? And I'm going to stop sharing, and then there's another getting on board slide that we'll come back to.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Liz. So we have had a couple of questions. We had a flurry of questions after we spoke about what are reserves, so they are quite specific questions. I don't know if you want me to just read a couple out and
yeah, absolutely. Read a couple out and we'll see.
So Kate asked, does designated funds have to be for capital expenditure, or can it be for wages for a future year?
That's a really interesting question. Who asked that? What's her name? Sorry.
Kay.
Kay. That's a really interesting question. All the examples I give are always for capital, aren't they? Because it's easy, frankly. In my thinking, I think salaries for a future year that aren't covered by a future restricted or current restricted fund, that's what I think reserves are for. Designated funds need to be specific, they need to be for a specific thing, and they need to be time bound. I think reserves are there to cover the risks on things like future salaries, but I'm not going to give you a definitive answer. I am going to look it up after this, and if I find anything, I will add it to the slide. I don't see many designated funds for future salary costs, I have to say.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
I'm not an advisor.
Harold has asked, where a fixed asset has been funded from a restricted fund, should this be excluded from the calculation?
Yes, Harold, that's a really good question as well. Thank you. So many balance sheets are presented in the columnar approach, as is the SOFA, and some balance sheets, often where fixed assets have been funded by restricted funds, have restricted and unrestricted, and then it's really easy and simple to tell, and they absolutely come out. It only relates to unrestricted. There is a note, a disclosure note called assets by fund type, that in the past I used to include in sessions like this, but I see it quite rarely in annual accounts, and it's not always there, and so I took it out. If you have an asset by fund note, that will tell you towards the end of the account whether your fixed assets are held in your restricted or unrestricted. But the short answer, and as you can tell, I'm not good at short answers, is yes, it excludes restricted fixed assets.
Bro, I'm just going to jump down. I'm conscious that we might not have time to answer all, but there's some kind of principal questions that I think are quite interesting as well. So Jim asked, to what extent should reserves be put into locked-in higher interest accounts that may not be quickly accessible compared to easy access type accounts?
Hello, Jim. Is that you? It's nice to see you. Good question. Thank you. And I'm going to dodge that. It's not an advice session, but what I would encourage you to do is to read through CAF's larder, fridge, freezer, and there's a link, typology or approach, and there's a link in the slides that come round. So for the past few years, we haven't really had the challenge, have we? It hasn't been an interesting question to ask because interest rates have been so low. So for small charities that don't have enormous pots, it hasn't been interesting enough to ask, whereas now it is an interesting question. And thinking about what you need in the near, mid and longer term and how you invest or save that to get a better return is a question we're thinking about more now than we have done for the last few years. But I'm going to neatly dodge that question, Jim, because I think it falls into advice. Sorry, but I would revisit that CAF link. That might help.
Thanks, Liz. And then the last question, Darren's asked that one of the slides you talked about how having a good reserves policy would give confidence to funders. And Darren's asking, is there a real risk that a strong balance sheet pushes funders away? If so, how do you overcome that? So yeah.
Hi, Darren. Nice to see you. Yeah, I mean, there's always that risk, isn't there? We know that. How real is it? So it's a perceived risk. Absolutely. If you're a fund-seeking charity, how your financial position is interpreted by funders is a real thing, right? It's a real concern. And some funders do have caps on reserves and their eligibility criteria, which is intended to be helpful. So there is always a risk that you might look too rich, financially comfortable. When I worked at the Association of Charitable Foundations, which was some time ago, the membership body for grants and foundations in the country, I was told very clearly in my induction in week 1, when you've met one foundation, you've met one foundation. They're all very different. Some will prefer a lower risk approach, where maybe they partner with organisations with stronger balance sheets. Some will inevitably be very comfortable with a higher risk approach. If that organisation is doing exactly what they want, they might actually be a bit more tolerant of weaker balance sheets. So I think there's a real range, and then most of them are somewhere in the middle. So I don't think, but this isn't a popular thing to say often, that we can game it. I think we have to come up with the reserves policy that is right for our organisation, and then find the funding partners that fit, because I think we open as many doors as we close. But I think there's a range, Darren, if I'm honest. And I don't know what your subsector is, and maybe you have, I don't know what the trends are in your subsector, and I'd love to know what your response to that is. I don't know if we've got time.
Yeah, go on, Darren, tell us.
Give us your thoughts. Give me a quick riposte, Darren.
Hi there. Yeah, I mean, I'm a trustee and treasurer of a healthcare charity, and we're fortunate to have quite a healthy balance of reserves. Close to probably 18 months worth, and we've noticed in the last month or so that grant givers are declining our request for funding, even though they've been there supporting us for years. And the reason they're giving is that your reserve policy is just too healthy. So that's a problem for us, and it's difficult to know how to overcome it. Which is why I asked the question. I don't know whether any other attendees have anything to add on that subject, but sometimes you can get too much of a good thing and it works against you.
Darren, absolutely. I think many of us are sending solidarity here. Many of us are probably quite envious at your 18 months. The short answer in a group session like this, it's now 1 minute over, is for me, it comes down to financial storytelling. If we've got higher, right, what is our target reserve? If we thought that through and we can defend that, and it's really reasonable and it's prudent, and we're in excess of that, then what is our plan to spend it down? Or are we in excess because we can see financial challenges ahead and we're taking a long dated view? And then for me, it all comes down to financial storytelling. If we are intentional and really thinking through what our financial strategy is, and we can clearly articulate that and defend it, we still might not be at the top of some funders' priority list, but then we've kind of given it the best shot. But that's a really unhelpful answer, and I wish you all the luck. But we probably, sorry, Darren. Back to you, Daisy. I think I will get your slide up.
Thank you, Liz. It definitely feels like a topic that we could talk about all afternoon, doesn't it? Don't worry about the slide if it's a bit too much. I was just going to say very quickly, thank you so much to Liz. I've learnt loads myself, and I hope that everyone else on the session has as well. We will send around the slides, we'll send around the recording afterwards. I just wanted to take a moment to share about more stuff that Getting On Board's doing that might help you. So this was one of the sessions of our Trustee Learning Programme. I think we've got about 25 coming up between now and Christmas, so please go and have a look at the rest of those. We've got free guides and resources around diverse recruitment, how to become a trustee. So there's lots of resources onwards that can help you. I've just finished adding to our Eventbrite the Festival of Trusteeship, so that's in Trustees Week at the beginning of November. We've got a whole week where we've got 4 events a day talking about all things governance, all things trusteeship. And then our website's full of resources as well. So I just wanted you to know that you're not alone. There's lots of stuff where we can help you, and hopefully we will see you again. I've popped into the chat just a link to the evaluation form. I'll also put that in the email as well, so don't worry about grabbing the link now. And also our Eventbrite, it's where you can go and join us for some future sessions. So thank you once again to Liz. You were brilliant, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and hope to see you again soon. Take care.
Thanks, Daisy. Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone. It was nice work.